Hello, this is Justin Williams with the Wolfpacker Podcast. I'm joined, as always, with Matt Carter, co-host Matt Carter, and we're going to break down the 74-70 overtime loss that NC State just dropped to number 19 Clemson on Tuesday, January 5th. Before we get too far into this podcast episode, this podcast is brought to you in part by JFQ Lending. With interest rates below 3%, there has never been a better time to lock in a low fixed interest rate on your mortgage. You'll never need to think about refinancing again. Set it and forget it. And with JFQ Lending, you are guaranteed to get the highest level of customer service. They have an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau and over 3,000 five-star reviews. Give Hunter Clausen a call today at 480-513-3992 or email Hunter directly at hclausen@jfqlending.com. That's HCLAUSSEN at jfqlending.com. JFQ Lending, Inc., Equal Access Lender, licensed in over 40 states, www.jfqlending.com. And while you're at it, head over to thewolfpacker.com and use promo code PACK60. That's promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. Obviously, we're right in the heat of battle of ACC play and a game between two teams that could potentially contend for the top tier of the ACC this year in a wide open season in the 2020-2021 campaign. So use that promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content here to keep up with the Wolfpack men's and women's basketball, all the premium good stuff on the site over the next few months into the spring. And before we get too far in, I want to remind our listeners at home to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcast app, wherever you listen to podcasts. So give us a subscribe. Tell us what you like about the podcast. We really appreciate your support as always. So Matt, let's talk about NC State's first ACC loss of the season. A game that, I think big picture wise, you can take some positives out of this game. It felt like a heavyweight battle between two teams that, could contend for potential ACC title this year. And then, as I already mentioned, there's not a lot of there's no giants this year. There's no teams that are guaranteed Final Four teams. No really, top 10 teams have identified themselves at this point yet in the league. And so what you saw tonight was, close overtime battle on the road between NC State, who wasn't unranked going into this game, but, a team that looks pretty capable of making the top 25 at some point during this season. And then Clemson, a team that is ranked number 19 and entering this game had only lost to another ranked team on the road in Virginia Tech, who's tied at number 19 in the poll. And they had, been in several other Power 5 contests this year entering this game. But on the flip side, there's also some negatives that we obviously have to talk about. NC State had a 6-point lead there late in the game, a game that really got away from the Wolfpack. The Wolfpack led for most of this game, pretty much from, the first opening minutes of the first half all the way down to pretty much the end of regulation when Clemson was able to tie up the game and was unable to make a game-winning shot there as time expired. But, of course, the Tigers come away with it in overtime. NC State comes away with the 4-point loss. So what do you think this game, big picture-wise, do you take away more good or do you take away more bad from what you saw tonight?
Good. Sure, good. Look, Clemson's a good team. And NC State should have won the game. I think NC State was a better team. They just didn't put Clemson away. I think some free throws outside of DJ Funderburk was an issue. Obviously, we'll talk about the turnovers were an issue, but the reality is, I have to go back and look here. NC State for the third straight ACC game pretty much led. If you go with regulation only, led the entire game. NC State, once Jericho Hellum made a jumper with about 12:26 to go. Once Cam Hayes made a three with 10 minutes to go in the first half. They led the rest of the way until Clemson tied it with 38.3 seconds to go. So that's about 30 minutes of having the lead straight. And they never trailed after Devin Daniels hit a three less than 5 minutes into the game. So for the final 35 minutes of regulation, NC State either led or was tied. And they led for probably 95% of those 35 minutes. They just couldn't put them away. That's kind of been one of the stories thus far, and that's probably an element of youth. Um, they're controlling games, but they're not putting teams away. They almost did against UNC, but they certainly didn't put Boston College away when they should have. And you couldn't put Clemson away, and that partially a tribute to Clemson. You have to give them credit. Nick Honor was lights out, and the beauty of Brad Brownell's squad at Clemson is their depth, among other things, and they have the ability to beat you with multiple people. So a lot of people talk about Amir Sims being scoreless for much of the game, but the beauty of Clemson is that they're actually good enough to maybe win a game without Amir Sims playing his best. But there was a lot of you went on the road against arguably, as crazy as it sounds, the best team in the ACC at this point in this kind of season, which is, I noted in my prediction, the fact that I think 5 of the top 7 guys or 6 of the top 8 guys, something like that, were back from last year's team. Those guys can handle the disruptions and all of that stuff much better than your average team. And quite frankly, you probably should win the game. So the negative is the disappointment of not winning, but big picture-wise, NC State wasn't going to go 20-0 in the ACC. You're not going to get punished for losing at Clemson in overtime. So the only negative I have about the loss is right now it looks like there's going to be a lack of opportunity to have quality wins in the ACC, and that was one staring them in the face right off the bat. And you just don't know how many of those opportunities you're going to get. So that's the biggest regret. And otherwise, I'm mostly positive reaction from the performance.
Well, I still think there's an opportunity to get some quality wins. Let's not, sell the ACC too short just yet. It's been a limited non-conference slate, and obviously Clemson was the most impressive in that non-conference slate, along with Virginia Tech, who are the 2 teams that are the highest ranked teams in the league right now. So, we're going to have to see what the rest of the league can do. But I think you made an interesting point about, kind of the similarity into how these first 3 conference games have gone for NC State. I think they've lost the second half in each of the 3 contests. The only difference tonight was in the first 2 games, you saw a little bit of a slump there entering halftime. Like NC State jumped out to big leads in both the Boston College and the Carolina games at home. And then, the Eagles and the Tar Heels were able to make a late run in the first half, take a little bit of momentum in the halftime. And it looked like that was going to be the case with Clemson tonight. NC State had an 8-point lead with 4 minutes to go in the first half. Clemson goes on a little bit of a run, shrinks the lead to 2, but then DJ Funderburk came up big with basically a 5-0 run on his own there in the last 47 seconds of the half. Makes a couple layups, or 1 layup, 1 dunk, and a free throw on an and one. And NC State was able to take a 7-point lead into halftime. And I thought they played competitive in the second half, similar to kind of the Carolina game. It seemed like Clemson kept throwing punches, and NC State seemed to have an answer for most of it, pretty much until the last 8 minutes of the game. Clearly, Clemson's defensive priority stepped up. I thought NC State was playing, pretty decent defense as well there down the stretch, but they just weren't able to make shots. I asked Coach Keats after the game if it was something in specific that Clemson did, and he admitted no, it's just a matter of, some of the inexperience on his team, not being able to make shots down the stretch. NC State finishes the final 10 minutes of the game with just 2 made field goals and ends up losing that lead that they were able to take pretty much late into the game. So, missed opportunity, but I'm with you. I definitely take a lot more good out of this game than bad, because it shows that in a crazy year where Clemson is, for now seems to be the number 1 team in the ACC. If you can go take the number 1 team in the ACC into overtime, lead for most of that game, it shows that you have the talent and the capability to contend for a league title this year, a position that NC State has not been in a very, very long time. So I think, as frustrating as the loss was tonight, and as frustrating as some of the mental lapses were down the stretch, I think we obviously need to talk about, Devin Daniels' 3 turnovers there late in the game. Otherwise had a pretty decent game, but obviously the 3 turnovers are what's going to be remembered. But, considering all of that, I think there's a lot more room for excitement, even though there's some disappointment tonight. NC State's going to have an opportunity to bounce back this Saturday against Miami, a team that just lost to Carolina. They're now 0-4 in the ACC. They're going to be hungrier than ever. But, NC State's going to have to bounce back and find ways to beat teams that they're supposed to beat. Keep in mind, NC State was a 5-point underdog tonight, going down to Little John Coliseum, a place that Coach Keats is winless. He's now 0-3 in Little John Coliseum, a place that NC State has had a lot of struggles in. So NC State did cover the spread, if that's a little bit of a silver lining there for some of the listeners. They barely exceeded expectations. So we'll see what they can do moving forward. What do you think it is, Matt, about Little John Coliseum that seems to be the thorn in NC State's side? One thing, we were both watching it on TV, obviously, game that's 4.5 hours away from Raleigh, in the middle of a pandemic, so we didn't go. But on TV, it was the first time this season I was watching an NC State game, and I could hear the fans in the crowd. It didn't sound like a full house by any means. I know there was limited capacity, but it's still, with the fans, it felt like it had that intensity and that energy of an ACC game that's kind of been lacking in some of these games without, like, literally no fans. So what is it about Little John? And did you kind of feel the same way about, the fans maybe potentially making an impact? Because for some of these freshmen, I mean, that's like the first time they've played before a crowd of over like 200 people in their college careers. So just your thoughts on those two things.
I think, first of all, you're right. NC State's now 2-9 in his last 11 games at Little John. One of those wins was Scott Wood hitting a three-pointer from the corner. I want to say there was seconds left in the game when he did that to win by 1. I feel like Clemson, though, probably plays a lot of teams tough at Little John. Like, I feel like I've seen UNC lose quite a bit at Clemson over the years. Feel like I've seen Duke.
Duke lost last year.
Yep. So I think it was interesting when I did the predictions. I looked back at Brad Brownell, and it would surprise you. His ACC record may surprise some people. Now, he hasn't had that standout year where they had really, I think one year they had a pretty nice ACC record, but he's been there 11 years. And other than 2 years, in 9 out of his 11 years, it's pretty much been a 500 ACC team, which probably means that they win most of their games at home. And so I think we need to, at some point, kind of get out of our preconceived notion, maybe because Brownell hasn't had a lot of postseason success. I think he's had a Sweet 16, but it's not like Clemson's that weird team that doesn't seem to make a lot of NCAA tournaments, but at the end of the year, you look up and they're like 9-11 or 10-10 or 11-9 in the ACC and right in the middle of the pack. And let's be bluntly honest, if you were to average NC State out over the years, they're probably right in the middle of the pack of the ACC as well. So I think there's an element of that to it, and maybe we have a bad perception, an incorrect perception of Clemson a little bit. And then this year happened to be, I'm very bullish right now on NC State chances. I mean, we didn't mention Braxton Beverly didn't play. And so they only played 7 players, and if you're really honest about it, they played 6, because I think Darian Sebron played maybe 5 or 7 minutes in the game. In an overtime game against maybe the deepest team in the ACC. So it's just one of those years where I think Clemson and NC State a lot of times kind of match up well with each other in terms of stacking up in the ACC similarly. And this happened to be another one of those years. You may remember 2 years ago, they were both fighting for the ACC tournament in the first round, or they thought they were fighting for the ACC tournament in the first round, NCAA tournament in the first round of the ACC tournament, and State had that great rally to win the game. Of course, it turned out that all of our thoughts and conventional wisdom were totally off, because neither one of them were probably playing for a right to the NCAA tournament that day. And so I think that's a big part of it. And I did think there was a bit of an element of a crowd, Obviously, South Carolina is letting people into indoor venues, and so that might be a little small thing to watch this year. It might make Clemson a little bit tougher at Little John because they actually have a little bit more natural, and that's a real thing. I'm telling you, of all the sports, I think basketball misses fans the most of all the sports.
Just
Uh,
ask Duke.
yeah, I think that I've seen a couple of buzzer beaters uh, in college basketball where the fans would have gone nuts and the bench would have just erupted and gone crazy. And without the fans there, it was a very ho-hum response, kind of that type of response from the players. I think they need that, a little bit of that adrenaline to feed off of. Maybe they've been spoiled by it over the years and they're not used to not having it. And so I do think that's a little bit of an advantage that Clemson had, for sure. Kind of underrated.
I mean, you raise good points about Clemson. I do think they're an underrated ACC program. I mean, as recently as Keats' first season back in 2017, 2018, I mean, Clemson was a top 4 team that had a double bye in the ACC tournament. And I know NC State and Clemson were battling for that top 4 seed back when the ACC tournament was in the Barclays Center in Brooklyn in Keats' first season. NC State ended up dropping that game that they didn't get the buy-in to Boston College that year. So, Clemson is a team that has recently been there at the top of the ACC. I think they were a 5 seed maybe that year in the NCAA tournament. So a year that I think, Clemson's probably on their way to being a top 4 type of seed in the NCAA tournament. I think when I checked this morning, Joe Lenardi had them as like a 3 seed. So that's the type of resume. That's the type of team that you're competing against. I know number 19's Clemson squad doesn't sound like a powerhouse by any means, but in a year with so much uncertainty and all the pauses and no fans, experienced team like Clemson. I mean, look, they went 10 deep tonight. All 10 players played over 8 minutes. 9 of them played over 13 minutes. And then, on the flip side, NC State, you said they went 6 deep. Realistically, I mean, Sebron played limited minutes to make him technically 7 deep, but Devin Daniels played all 45 minutes tonight. And maybe those turnovers down the stretch were a byproduct of, tired legs or mental exhaustion. I don't know. I don't want to try to make excuses for Devin. All in all, I thought he came out hot on offense. I thought early, I tweeted, it looks like we're getting a Devin Daniels that's on his game tonight. I know many times you can kind of tell early how it's going to go with him. If those floaters are dropping early on, typically he can get cooking. He got a little bit more quiet there in the second half when, they needed some big buckets. I know he stopped one of the droughts there late in the second half, but ultimately those 3 turnovers down the stretch proved to be fatal for NC State. So we talked about briefly Braxton Beverly being out, his senior presence, a guy that, has played a lot of point guard this year for NC State. Cam Hayes played more minutes tonight in his absence, was good and stretches in the first half, also had some struggles. I think he finished the night with 3 turnovers of his own, and probably the reason why he wasn't in the game late when it was such a tight 1-possession game with the game on the line. But what do you take away from Devin Daniels tonight? Do you think this is just something that, NC State's going to have to live with, some of the inconsistency from him, or have you seen enough flashes to where maybe once, they finally get into the thick of things in ACC play, you can start fixing some of those mistakes and you can expect more of the consistent 15 to 20 point a night performances. I mean, he was effective. 10 rebounds tonight, a good game overall, but again, it's those fatal mistakes down the stretch that really costed him and the team.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be unfair to kind of harp too much on the 3 turnovers at the end of the game, at the one there at the end of regulation. You seem to get to tighten up a little bit there. And remember, Clemson's a good defensive team. That's kind of what they hang their hat on them. But right, he had a double-double. And most important to me, what was important was he had 10 defensive rebounds, which took away the ability of Clemson to get the second chance points. NC State actually won second chance points 9-7. And that's a nice. You need for NC State to be a good rebounding team. They need Devin Daniel to do that part. So, in a way, kind of like the Jericho Hallam 1-point performance against UNC, where people are starting to come around to. It was still a pretty good game by Jericho Hallam. The 3 turnovers were costly at the time, but I'll be blunt. I think kind of you and I talked about before we recorded. I believe all of the guards had issues in this game. You mentioned Cam Hayes had the tough stretch, which actually kind of was. I think it was right before Daniel just turned over. I mean, it was he split a couple of free throws and then he missed. He had a bad turnover. Thomas Allen had a really bad stretch where he missed 2 free throws when he fouled a guy on the other end of the floor, and then he turned the ball over. Shaquille Moore was probably the most consistent of those 3 guys. He had the huge block shot to preserve overtime. Made some great passes. But if we're being honest, he's also the guy that apparently lost Nick Honor with 38.3 seconds to go to allow a guy who at that time was 4 for 5 from 3-point range to make a 3 that made him 5 for 6 from 3-point range. And it was the guy, that's the one guy you can't lose, right? That's just under no circumstances. Whomever guarded Nick Honor, don't watch the ball, watch Nick Honor. And I think Kevin Keith said the freshman got in a bad position or something like that in the post game. So,
yep.
So I think really, to be honest with you, you look at NC State and you say they should have won this game, even though you recognize there's a lot of room for improvement from NC State. And Manny Bates had to play the overtime with 4 fouls and couldn't defend in the post like he wanted to against Amir Sims, and a couple of key late baskets by Amir Sims. You didn't have Braxton Beverly. You got it. You didn't get your A game from your backcourt. Jericho Hallam's fouled out in regulation. Really, with the exception of DJ Funderburk, they all probably had things you could point to and say you didn't do well, and they still could have won the game. Kind of reminds me of the UNC game where after the game I was like, man, State controlled the whole game, and yet State, the team I felt like had more left out on the court than UNC that day. Obviously Daniels is going to get the spotlight because he's a 5th-year senior and probably a little bit of a polarizing guy because I'm sure some people don't like the shot selection from time to time. He's fearless with the basketball. There's no question about this. And but I thought all in all, he did his part. Maybe a few more shots should have gone in. Obviously, the turnovers were tough, but like I said, Thomas Allen had a tough stretch. Shaquille Moore made a big mistake. Cam Hayes had a tough stretch. So, kind of, I think the blame can kind of be spread around.
Well, make no mistake, I'm still a Devin Daniels believer. I still think he's the best player on this team. I still think he's going to lead this team in scoring this year. And when it's all said and done, when NC State needs a bucket down the stretch, Devin Daniels is the guy that they're going to give the basketball to. But, he's going to be the first guy to admit that those turnovers down the stretch were on him. That's what he admitted in the post-game press conference. Probably the toughest one for him to do all season. After the turnovers down the stretch, he had to go face the media, and he owned up to it. And he knows his part as a senior leader on this team. So I expect a quick bounce back from Devin. And you talked about Shaquille Moore. I thought he was fantastic tonight. I mean, again, you obviously want to see him make the right defensive move there when Nick Honor hits that clutch 3 to tie the game late in the game. But, Moore, you look at his stats, he's the only guy other than Sebron who played only 7 minutes. He's the only guy on the roster that had a positive plus-minus rating. He led the team with a +4 rating in 32 minutes. I believe that's a new career high for him. But he finishes the night with 7 points, 10 rebounds, 8 of them on defense, 2 of them on offense, 3 assists, 2 blocks. I think maybe the first time he didn't get a steal this game, although it's hard to imagine he didn't get a steal with just I mean, he's a phenomenal defender. It's amazing to watch him play defense. But I do want to talk about the front court before we move on to game balls. You touched on Manny Bates a little bit. Obviously, he was a question mark entering this game. He was a game time decision. NC State ends up getting Bates tonight. He played 35 minutes, but a little bit more quiet than what we've seen from him as of recent on the offensive end. Just 7 points tonight. He blocked one shot, got a steal, grabbed 4 rebounds. So you'd like to see him get a little bit more active on the boards. And you mentioned before the podcast, there was a couple plays down the stretch there where Clemson was able to score on the post, whether it was Sims or Hall with that weird little floater that bounced off the back of the rim and went straight up and then bounced in. He looked like he was a guy that was playing with 4 fouls and a guy that, NC State couldn't afford to lose at that point in the game. But on one of those possessions, if he can just find a way to make a stop, maybe the result is different. So, not the best night of the season for Bates, but probably understandable considering he's coming back from that left leg injury that made him a game time decision. So maybe a little bit of soreness there, maybe expect to see him bounce back a little bit more as he gets to full health. And then DJ Funderburk, again, second straight game that he's been back. I thought the second straight game he's been great. Came up big on the offensive end many times. He led the team in scoring with 20 points tonight, 5 of 8 from the field, 9 of 9 from the free throw line, which was very important. 7 boards, so pretty active on the boards. But all in all, and not to mention, I mean, the defensive performance by Bates, Funderburk, and Helms, the combination of the 3 in keeping Amir Sims scoreless, I believe, for the better part of 35 minutes tonight. I mean, of course, Amir Sims finishes with 8 points. And as DJ Funderburk said after the game in the post-game press conference, those were a big 8 points. So he was still productive. He still, filled up his stat sheet, but maybe not as much as he typically would. And I know that was a key to the game going into the night, according to Coach Keats. So I think that was a success for the most part in guarding him. But what do you make of Funderburk and Bates before we move on to game balls?
I thought that Funderburk was great. He didn't force it because, quite frankly, early in the game, he wasn't getting much action. At one point, I looked up. He was in the game with 4 minutes left, and I was like, "That's the first time Funderburk's been in the game." And I had to look at the box score, and I said, "Oh wait, he actually had played before." He was clutch at the free throw line, and that's an issue for NC State, by the way. Free throw shooting has not been what it needs to be in ACC play. And that might be an issue. You can't have Thomas Allen missing 2 free throws. Shaquille Moore has been shaky at the free throw line. You need and Cam Hayes has missed one. Devin Daniels, I think, missed 2 of his first 4. Yeah, I even texted a buddy. If the game gets close, they might want to get the ball to DJ Funderburk at the end of the game to shoot the free throws. So, I really don't have a lot of qualms with Funderburk's performance at all. Manny seemed a little tentative, I thought. The 4 fouls, I'm sure, played a role in that, particularly in overtime. And, I'm sure he wasn't 100%. Kevin Keats said it was a late afternoon confirmation that he would play. If it took that long, if it really took that long to confirm 100% certain that he's playing, and that means he was probably toughing it out a little bit. Because if he was 100%, you're not waiting till afternoon of the game to play. So probably wasn't 100%. It didn't look like it was bothering him too much, but I did think he was a little bit tentative on defense late with the 4 fouls, and that was a big part. And I think one of the mistakes NC State did make was not aggressively going after Amir Sims early in the overtime, getting him out of the game. He was not having a good game, but he's still their best player. And if you took him out of the game in overtime, that's a little sink in the armor that goes away, right? That you can take off of Clemson. Clemson players feel better when he's on the floor, even if he's not playing well. And if you get him out of the game with the game on the line in overtime, you might change the mentality and the mindset of those Clemson players a little bit. But
there was an opportunity to get him fouled out late in regulation too, when Moore around the free throw line, a little bit left of the free throw line, he was in a defensive stance, might have still been moving a little bit. He tries to draw the charge, but ends up getting the block call on him. Would have been Sims's fifth, I think, with like 2 minutes to go. That was a big one, but I agree with you. I think they could have targeted Sims a little bit more there, at least in overtime, to get him out of the game. Sorry to cut you off. Did you have any other points on Sims?
No, that's pretty fair.
Well, let's go ahead and give our game balls out. I'll let you start, as always. I think there's clearly an obvious one. I'll let you take it because I've got something up my sleeve.
Game ball goes to, obviously, I thought that clearly DJ Funderburk was NC State's most effective player. 4 offensive rebounds, 20 points, 7 rebounds, only 1 turnover, had a steal, fancy footwork there along the sideline to I guess legally stay in bounds.
He was clearly out of bounds.
Yeah.
He was clearly, that was just a missed call. And one other point, I thought the officiating tonight for the first time in the ACC play was a little bit questionable tonight.
It was some, and I got kind of be fair, that kind of went both ways. I think there was one play where Amir Sims clearly pushed Devin Daniels to the floor and they missed it. They reviewed it. And then they called Amir Sims for an offensive foul later. And I was like, I think it was right after they review. And I was like, that's not, well.
I think it was a reach in on somebody else. But I know exactly what you're talking about. There was a couple points in that last 10 minutes where there was some clear phantom calls there. But all in all, I think the officiating's been better this year without the fans.
Yeah. The Hellem's 5th foul was a strange call.
Yeah,
that was just a strange call. That would be the one that really stood out from an NC State standpoint. And I think Honor had a 3-point play where the guy whistled a foul on somebody who was under the basket on a floater, and I'd have to go back and look at that one. I didn't.
It was an Allen touch foul when he was getting into the paint. I mean, I think if you're going to call a foul there, it's probably a foul on the floor before the shot was going off. But
yeah, and it was a late whistle too.
Yeah.
I mean, it was whistled as the ball was in the net almost, and that's one of those let it go. So, but it was I thought it was a fun game and a weird game. One of the things we talked about, PJ Hall getting the lucky bounce late in the game. I know you got to get to your game ball, but it's kind of ironic and fair for Clemson to get a bounce on a shot, because how crazy was it that Clemson had 2 3-pointers that literally went around the basket 2 or 3 times and didn't go in. I mean, you just don't see that very often.
I think it's time for Clemson to just embrace the fact that they're a basketball school now. Get killed in the college football playoff to Ohio State, and then Trevor Lawrence doesn't win the Heisman. I think the fans were booing that when that was announced during the game in Little John Coliseum. So maybe something to be excited about for Clemson fans. And to your point, I think, before I get to my game ball, it was intriguing to see NC State in the middle of what seemed to be a heavyweight battle, towards the 2 top tier ACC teams going at it. It just seems strange to see those 2 jerseys be the heavyweight battle, in 2021 in ACC basketball. But, preview as to what's to come for the rest of the ACC schedule this year before we get to Greensboro, hopefully, knock on wood, in March. But I'll go ahead and give out my game ball. I told you I had a trick up my sleeve, and it's going to go to a guy that maybe didn't score as many points as a typical game ball recipient would get. But I'm going to give it to, for the second straight game, freshman guard Shaquille Moore. 7 points, as I said, 10 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 blocks, and very quality 32 minutes tonight. Again, the stats don't always reflect it, but you can't say enough about his defense. I mean, Devin Daniels has been the best defender on this team at least the past 2 seasons, and Shaquille Moore's really making a strong case to take that title away from Daniels. He's he's just a bulldog. I mean, that's what he's referred to by his teammates and Coach Keats after the game. And I mean, that's really the perfect characterization of who Moore is on the court. He's a boost of energy every time he's out there. And frankly, with his play recently, he still hasn't started a game yet. Hayes was the first freshman to get a start tonight in the absence of Braxton Beverly, but Shaquille Moore keeps playing like this. It's I think we're going to see more 30-minute type of stat sheets from him, and a guy that I think by the end of the season, he keeps playing like this. I think he's going to end up infiltrating the starting five for the Wolfpack. So my game ball goes to Shaquille Moore. Your game ball went to DJ Funderburk. That wraps up our post-game reflections podcast for the 74-70 overtime road loss to number 19 Clemson on Tuesday, January 5th. NC State will next play Miami in PNC Arena on Saturday at noon.
Scheduled to play Miami.
Scheduled to play. Excuse me. We're still in 2020 extension into 2021 COVID pandemic year. So we'll see. The women's team had 2 games postponed this week because of a positive COVID case within that program. So you hate to see that. They're probably going through what the men's team went through in December and what pretty much every team in the country is going to go through at some point this season, unfortunately. So we just hope everyone is safe and healthy, of course. But for all that said, before we tune out here, please, again, remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you listen to podcasts. And, of course, you can always stream us live on thewolfpacker.com. We always post up a story the next morning. And then like us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at The Wolfpacker is our main account. You can follow me personally at Justin H. Will. You can like us on Facebook, NC State Wolfpack, on thewolfpacker.com. And, of course, while you're on thewolfpacker.com, use promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. And for Matt Carter, this is Justin Williams, and this has been the Wolfpacker Podcast.